For anthropologists and archaeologists, rock art is a kind of window into our ancestors' evolution, migration, and lifestyle. These insights that we get from rock art are highly valued by archaeologists because they complement the often scant information provided by excavated objects. It turns out that there are common themes in rock art between sites in Europe and caves where they have discovered rock art in China. In fact, some recurring motifs in rock art have been observed all over the world. It is truly remarkable that the hunter-gatherers of the Yunnan province in China left very similar creations to the Magdalenians, who lived nearly 9,000 kilometers away in Western Europe and thousands of years prior. Both feature outline images of human predators and prey, from bears and lions to stags, horses, and bulls.
A cliché, as you know, is an overused and worn-out phrase, and these are to be avoided like the plague in your essays. Indeed, someone once said, I quote, "There is no greater danger to either education or thinking than the popular phrase." Let me digress a little further. Originally, a cliché was a printer's term, back in the days when letters were set one by one, for a ready-made block of type of frequently used phrases, usually in the newspaper business. So, there you are. Clichés were also known as stereotypes. Now, if you think of graphic design as a language, with its own vocabulary, grammar, and so on, it too must have its clichés. Obvious examples would be the twin Greek masks of comedy and tragedy that symbolize the theatre, and, more popularly known, the heart as a symbol of love, especially on Valentine cards and so on.
All whales, dolphins and porpoises are social animals, although the degree of sociability varies greatly from one species to another. Differences of behaviour have not evolved by chance. Living in close proximity to other animals has certain costs and benefits, so we can expect the group size adopted by a species to be the most suitable for its environment and lifestyle. River dolphins, for example, have a fairly simple social system, forming small groups of just a few animals, rarely more than 10. On the other hand, many of the oceanic dolphins may roam the seas in groups of thousands. Also, there can be differences within species. For example, with sperm whales, females and juveniles form groups, while adult males are solitary. Some of the reasons for living in groups include greater efficiency in searching for and catching food, benefits for mating, learning, defense, and sensory integration.
In his great novel, Remembrance of Things Past, or In Search of Lost Time, Marcel Proust explored what are called involuntary memories, those that come to us quite suddenly without conscious effort, usually triggered by one of the senses. The fact that his book has 2 titles in English might suggest there is some doubt as to how our minds go about remembering things. In perhaps the most well-known such episode in the novel, the character Marcel is reminded of his childhood by the aroma produced when dunking a cake in a cup of tea. This is not far away from the belief that as we get older, we can remember quite clearly incidents from years ago, but find it hard to remember what we did last week. Proust's insight into memory is certainly true of one way the mind works. But why and how do we remember what we do?
I want to look now at the 3 main approaches historians have taken towards the English Revolution, or Civil War. There is a 4th point of view, taken up by most school children when they first meet the subject, but it can hardly be called historical. On the one hand, school children tend to have a romantic image of the Cavaliers, who were supporters of the monarchy, as aristocratic, charming, flashily dressed, and up for a bit of fun. On the other hand, they tend to regard the Roundheads or Puritans, who were followers of Oliver Cromwell, as miserable, working class, dressed in black, and insisting on a life without luxuries. It isn't difficult then to take sides. How did I get into anthropology? Well, I'm not an anthropologist. Not trained in it anyway. In fact, I'm a marine biologist. And it's more that I'm interested in the strand lopers, the beach walkers, if you like, than in anthropology generally. In fact, it was through my early interest in all things to do with the sea that I first heard of them. As a kid, my favourite pastime was getting down to the beach and mucking about in rock pools and collecting anything the sea tossed up. And, the strand lopers lived off the sea and seashore, gathering food such as mussels, oysters, crabs and so on, just as I did. So when I heard of them, I thought, right, this is my kind of thing. And I felt a kind of, well, affinity for them.
To reach some kind of understanding of a period in the past, the Middle Ages, say, requires a creative act of the imagination, not unlike that of a novelist getting inside the skins of their characters or establishing the environment they live in. What must it have been like to be a peasant under a feudal baron? What might his beliefs and politics have been? Did he, for example, think his situation was simply part of the natural order of things, or that it was grossly unfair and needed to be overthrown? So you have to imagine the terms under which life was lived in those days, and learn to feel in a different way about things by putting yourself into a world very different from your own. Now, Of course, every age views the past from its own present, and an 18th century historian's concept of the Middle Ages will be very different from that of one from the 21st century, which is why each age has to write its history over again.
I want to take a quick look at how material culture, that is, the things or objects we value and use, tools, technology, etc., affects the non-material culture, our customs, behaviour, beliefs, attitudes, and so on. Now, of course, it works both ways. If you were, say, 18 years old when mobile phones became widespread, or when almost every home had a computer, you must have noticed a fairly significant change in people's attitudes and behaviour, including your own. These two technological innovations were readily accepted and considered very much a positive contribution to culture. On the other hand, there is the way in which our attitudes and beliefs have an effect on the material culture. Take, for example, genetic science. While many, if not most, people welcome the advances made in this field, from the discovery of DNA to the Genome Project and cracking the genetic code,
Ernest Hemingway was famously masculine. We can see this in the topics he wrote about, all those fights and bullfights, all those wars, all that hunting and fishing. All this, it is thought, was overdoing it, and must point to some deep insecurity in the man. Perhaps he felt that the conventional image of a writer, as a person who doesn't do a lot more than sitting at a desk, not visibly contributing much socially or economically to society as a whole, was unmanly, and carried a certain amount of guilt and shame with it. During the First World War, he was badly wounded, hospitalized, and fell in love with a nurse. He wrote a novel about a man who was badly wounded in the First World War, was hospitalized, and who fell in love with a nurse. The Spanish Civil War and the Second World War followed, as did books about his experiences in them. Now, how much can we draw on a writer's biography to explain his work?
Genealogy can be defined as the compilation of information necessary to construct what is usually known as a family tree, our pedigree, or our ancestry. It is a chart which shows the relationships between individual people in an extended family over a period of time. The first records of genealogy can be traced back to the earliest civilizations in northern Africa, who recorded successions of dynasties and wealthy families reaching back hundreds of years. This was usually done to establish rights to title, land, and property. There is evidence that this happened in many places in the world. However, it was the domain of the wealthy, and few people outside those circles were even aware that family ancestry could be recorded and traced. This situation changed in the early 19th century, when genealogy became more generally well known after the first practical guide to research was published.
As you know, there has been an unresolved debate as to when and why early humans first started to use fire. However, recent new findings from a study in South Africa have been the talk of the anthropological community. So what are these findings? Well, prehistoric ash and the remains of burnt bones are evidence that early humans used fire much longer ago than previously envisaged, 300,000 years earlier than believed, in fact. Scientists have found evidence of multiple fires, ash and bones, deep inside a cave, which means it is highly improbable the fires were started naturally. One question that still remains unanswered is why they were using fire. Some researchers are citing the burnt bones as proof that our ancestors cooked the meat, but it has also been suggested they ate the meat raw and then tossed the bones into the fire.
I'd like you to think for a moment about your hands and all the things you can do with them. You can use them to write or to drive. You can thread a needle, play the drums, build a wall, and so on and so forth. They can be careful and precise. Think of someone doing eye surgery, for example. But they can also generate huge forces. And here you might think of the sports person throwing a discus or lifting a heavy weight. How is it possible for our hands to be so incredibly flexible? Well, it's all down to the extraordinary complexity of the bones, ligaments, nerves, and muscles that lie beneath the skin of our hands. There are, for example, 9 muscles alone controlling just one thumb. Some of these are anchored to bones within the hand, while others link to the arm.
A new investigation into shark populations in the waters off Australia has discovered that there are 2 distinct species of great white shark, one to the east and one to the west of Bass Strait. This was discovered by tagging large numbers of sharks in the coastal waters all round Australia. Rather to the investigators' surprise, they found that while sharks from the east side certainly travelled to the west side of the continent and vice versa, they always returned to their home areas to breed. The 2 types of shark were found to have a distinct genetic makeup, indicating that interbreeding has not taken place. The implication of these research findings is that sharks may be more susceptible to changes in local marine environments than had previously been thought.
It's been reported recently that some business schools have decided to make changes to students' grades by increasing them by 10%. This means that a C grade automatically becomes a B, and a B grade automatically becomes an A under the new grading system. And the change is retrospective, which means that it applies to all grades that have been achieved since the school's current grading system, which was introduced in 2007, has been in place. Now, there are at least 8 business schools who've changed their grading levels, and they decided to award their graduates higher grades so they would be more attractive in the highly competitive job market. However, changing grades like this has been criticized by the academic and business communities because many people think the grades have been falsely exaggerated and don't reflect the true ability of the student.
Urban development is the first thing I wanted to talk about here in Perth. Urban development is going on at a great pace, and the standard approach here in Western Australia is for suburban development to happen at the outer edges of the city. You have suburbs slowly spreading out into areas that are cleared, and this is eating into both areas of native bushland and land that used to be used for farming, for agricultural purposes. The debate here is that, on one side, there's the idea that we need more housing. We have a housing shortage in Western Australia, and suburban expansion is essential. Suburban expansion on the edges of the city is cheaper and easier to do than building more homes within the city, even though it's recognised it creates lots of problems with infrastructure and so on. On the other side of the debate, people say that urban sprawl is destroying bush, and consequently the natural wildlife that exists there.
Now, one of the workplace models I want to look at today is telecommuting. Done properly, telecommuting makes good business sense, and companies can make huge savings on their overheads. It can also be a very effective lure to recruit quality employees, but companies need to plan ahead and create the right culture for it to work. It's not as simple as just giving everybody a laptop and sending them off to work from home. Management needs to look at training, security and communication issues before any kind of telecommuting agreement is entered into. Now, a key part of making it work is ensuring that every employee, and that's whether they're at home or in the office, has equal access to resources. And, of course, promotions. The last thing you want is to create a kind of us versus them scenario. The arrangement breaks down quickly if people start feeling isolated or limited in their chances of moving up the ladder if they aren't physically in the office.
There's no doubt that we have more consumer choices today than ever before. We all think we're good at making choices. Some of us even enjoy making them. And you would think that with all these consumer choices that people would be spending more money because they can get exactly what they want. Well, actually, that's not always the case. Let me tell you about one study that has produced results about this that are really quite counterintuitive. An experiment was done in an upmarket specialty grocery store in the U.S., where a tasting booth was set up, first offering consumers 24 different varieties of jam to try, and then at another time, they offered 6 varieties. Now, when there were more varieties, more customers stopped to try than when there were only 6. But only about 3% of them actually went ahead and selected a product to buy.
Long-term exposure to noise can lead to loss of hearing. The relative loudness of sounds is measured in decibels. Just to give you an idea of what this means, the sound of a whisper is 30 decibels, while a normal conversation is 60 decibels. The noise a vacuum cleaner makes is around 85 decibels. The danger zone, the risk of injury, begins at around 90. Continual exposure to sounds above 90 decibels can damage your hearing. Loud noises, especially when they come at you every day, all this noise can damage the delicate hair cells in your inner ear. Lots of everyday noises are bad for us in the long run. For example, a car horn sounds at around 100 decibels. A rock band at close range is 125 decibels. A jet engine at close range is one of the worst culprits at an ear-busting 140 decibels. The first thing to go is your high-frequency hearing, where you detect the consonant sounds in words.
Dr. Tony Wagner believes there are 7 skills that young people need to have in order for them to find and keep a good job in today's economy. But he thinks our schools are focusing too much on tests and academic performance and aren't doing enough to teach those skills. Let me give you an example. One of Wagner's 7 skills is the ability to work in an international team. This is because little teamwork is carried out in one building anymore. When most global companies have a problem, they create teams of people from all over the world to solve it. And these people meet online, in virtual meeting rooms. To succeed in this kind of environment, you need to be a good communicator and understand different cultures. Teams also need good leaders who lead by influencing others, but Wagner and the business people he interviewed say that young people today are unprepared for teamwork and leadership.
Well, employers are currently experiencing a love-hate relationship with social media. Some are using it to their advantage. They're reaching more customers, increasing sales, and improving their brand image through social networking sites. They're also using them for recruitment. On the other hand, many employers continue to see the bad side of social media and believe that it poses a threat to their business. Negative comments online can damage a brand, and employers also worry that employees might spend too much time online during working hours, stopping them from working effectively and completing all their tasks. But this problem provides employers with an opportunity. Employees who spend a lot of time on social networking sites do it because they're bored. They don't feel challenged and want to fill their time.
Could garages make good housing for the homeless? That's the idea behind the Pop-Up House project, a project to turn rows of disused garages in London into temporary accommodation for homeless people. It would allow a small home to be created, with a bedroom and shower room, and then every 5th garage in the line would be used as shared laundry, kitchen and eating facilities. The homes would be put together by the people who will live in them in the future, with the idea of teaching them building skills as well as giving them a home. It's hoped that because they will have their own space, their own front door, they'll be more likely to get back into society more quickly than by putting them into shared accommodation. We know people don't do well in that environment. And it will give them the education they need to get back into work.
If you designed an almost perfect anti-brain learning environment, it would look something like a typical classroom. And if you were to design an almost perfect anti-brain working environment, it would look something like a typical office cubicle. Why? Because tiny proteins called BDNFs are actually created when you exercise, and these help the brain to develop. So exercise boosts brain power. The problem lies in the fact that we measure distance today in terms of the space between the refrigerator, the bathroom and the couch. Says Robert Hutchins, "Whenever I feel like exercise, I lie down until the feeling passes." Our ancestors, on the other hand, walked an average of 12 miles a day, and hence the brain developed as a survival organ that was designed to solve problems in an unstable environment in almost constant motion. If our ancestors had lain around, well, let's just say that survival didn't favour the sedentary type.
To understand what extinct animals such as dinosaurs ate, we can compare their tooth types to the range of tooth types that we see with modern animals, such as carnivorous and herbivorous animals. So when we look at a tiger skull, we can look at aspects of its dentition, or its teeth, to understand what it ate. So when we see pointed and sharp teeth, we can see that they are very well adapted for slicing, shearing, and cutting flesh. Unlike the tiger, when we look at a herbivorous animal, a horse, we can see that its teeth are arranged in a nice flat grinding surface, and so when the top and lower teeth fit together, they actually grind up plant material. When we look at fossils like this one, which belongs to an allosaur, we can see teeth that are conical and recurve backwards with sharp points and serrated edges. These kinds of clues tell us that this animal was a meat-eating animal.
Okay, so we've discussed the mosquito's appearance and life cycle. Now let's cover what mosquitoes are most famous for, sucking blood. Mosquitoes suck blood from various animals. You see, a mosquito has a long feeder appendage in its mouth. The appendage penetrates an animal's skin. Then the mosquito sucks the animal's blood. Interestingly, only females suck blood. The blood they get enables them to reproduce.
How so?
Proteins in the blood they suck help them produce the eggs they lay. So they don't use the blood as food. For food, both female and male mosquitoes usually eat nectar from plants. Tragically, mosquitoes kill more people than any other creature on Earth. Their bites don't kill, though, but the diseases that mosquitoes carry do. Millions of people die every year from malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, and other diseases that mosquitoes carry. When mosquitoes bite people, they transmit whatever diseases they happen to be carrying.
People, animals, plants, and fungi all get diseases. Pathogens cause them. Pathogens are things such as bacteria and viruses. They enter living things and cause them to get sick and sometimes to die. But living things have defenses against pathogens. These defenses are found in their immune systems. There are two types of immune systems, innate and adaptive. First, let's examine the innate immune system. An innate immune system in a living thing is always active. It's an organism's first line of defense against diseases. Let's think about humans, shall we? The skin is our first defense. How? Well, it prevents many things from entering the body. Also, the mucus in the nose prevents airborne foreign bodies, many of which are harmful, from entering the body. What else? There are defenses in the body as well. For instance, both the stomach and intestines produce acids. Some of them are able to remove pathogens from the food we eat.
All of you, of course, can read. There was a time, however, when you couldn't, yet you all learned. Do you remember how you did that? There are several methods teachers use to teach reading. You probably learned by using a combination of them. There are 4 main methods of teaching reading. The first and most common is the phonics method. Here's how teachers use phonics. First, they teach their students the alphabet. So the students learn the letters and which sounds each one makes. The instructors also teach the students how letters can blend together. Then they often show the students sentences with similar sounds. For example, the cat sat on the hat. How now, brown cow? Or how about this one? There's a mouse in the house. You remember those, right? Well, as students learn more sounds, they learn more words. This helps them improve their vocabulary level.
We all know that the capital of the United States is Washington, D.C. However, when America first became a country, Washington didn't even exist. Back then, Philadelphia was the logical choice as the new country's capital.
Why Philadelphia? Why not Boston, New York, or even Charleston?
For several reasons. First, Philadelphia had a roughly central location in the U.S. at that time. Also, it had been a focal point of the American Revolution. The Continental Congress had met there before the war, and several major events took place there. So, why is Washington the capital and not Philadelphia? Mostly because of a riot in Philadelphia in 1783. Congress was meeting there when some soldiers disrupted them. The soldiers demanded payment for their service during the war, but Congress had no money. It asked the government of Pennsylvania to protect it, but the government refused.
The Mayans were a group of people who lived in Central America. They developed an advanced civilization. It lasted for... It lasted for many centuries. Its high point was between the years 200 and 900. The Mayans are famous for a number of things. They built many city-states. These were like small countries. Naturally, the center of each was a city. Farms surrounded these cities and supported them with food. Mayan cities also contained exceptional works of architecture. The ruins of some buildings can be seen today. There are both large palaces and stepped pyramids. The Mayans had a writing system and literature, but they didn't use paper. Odd, no? Instead, they wrote on stone, wood, and tree bark. Lots of writing was done on the insides and outsides of their temples and palaces. They also formed books from tree bark, but sadly, few of these books have survived. You've all probably heard about zoning laws, but many people are confused about what they are. So I'd like to cover them now. Local governments such as cities and counties typically pass zoning laws. They regulate how people use the land in certain parts of the city or country. Think about our city for a moment. It's divided into various districts. Some are commercial while others are residential. This isn't accidental. It's intentional. The city developed this way because of zoning laws. You see, in the commercial district, there are businesses, and in the residential district, there are houses and apartments. You can't open a factory in the residential district, and you can't erect an apartment building in the commercial district. You can't do these things because of zoning laws. There are actually quite a number of zones, as I just stated.
For years, TV advertisements and print advertisements dominated the advertising industry. Yes, TV commercials and newspaper and magazine ads were expensive, but for most advertisers, the money they spent was worth it. People were watching television and reading newspapers and magazines. But times are changing. Television is still the biggest segment for advertisers, but that won't last for much longer. Instead, the Internet will overtake both TV and print marketing very soon. There are several reasons for this. First is the Internet's growing popularity. Today, the number of people who surf the Internet is enormous. In the 1980s, few people owned personal computers. Nowadays, most households have at least one PC. And more people are using the World Wide Web every year. People are also getting their news from the Internet. That's making print newspapers and magazines less popular. Did any of you notice those strange greenish-colored lights in the sky last night? Anybody? Mark?
I did, sir. They were beautiful. But, what were they?
We call them the northern lights, but they're also called auroras. There are two types of auroras, those in the northern hemisphere and those in the southern hemisphere. In the north, we call them the aurora borealis. In the south, they're the aurora australis. Auroras appear as colorful streams of light in the sky in high northern and southern latitudes. They frequently occur during the months before or after the equinox. The equinox happens in March and September. That's when the planet is tilted, so
This winter has been rather cold. It almost feels like we're entering a new ice age. Now, don't laugh. This statement isn't as crazy as it seems. Yes, global warming is a hot topic these days, but more and more scientists are considering the possibility of global cooling occurring soon. This would result in the average temperatures on Earth dropping. It has happened in the past, and it will happen again in the future. Earth is warm now, but that's not always the case. In the past, large parts of the planet were covered in ice. We call these periods ice ages. Note the plural. There wasn't just one ice age. There have been several. During the recent past, we experienced the Little Ice Age. It lasted almost 500 years from around, say, 1300 to 1800. Okay, today's our first class, so I'd like to begin with some important definitions. We're going to use these terms all semester, so pay close attention. To begin with, chemistry is basically the study of matter. Matter is everything that makes up the universe. In this class, we're going to study the various elements and how they interact with one another. Sometimes they unite. When two or more elements unite, we call them compounds. Now, the study of chemical compounds is divided into two main branches of chemistry: organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry. Organic chemistry is the study of compounds that contain the element carbon. This basically covers, it covers all living things. Carbon is an element all living organisms have in common.
Pancake ice is an intermediate step between an open water configuration and a totally frozen body of water. We know that a combination of very cold temperatures and waves are necessary to make the pancakes form in the first place. After these waves make it form, there's an entire spectrum, so a wide collection of frequency waves that they would encounter, whether they be from wind shear or they be from the ocean long, slow waves. Easiest way to study it is to look at each individual range of frequencies, one after another, sort of gain a wider perspective on how the pancake ice interacts with waves. The ultimate aim of our research is to better inform the meteorological modelers of the world who are looking at Antarctica as well as the Arctic
The heyday of the English landscape garden was the 18th century, and it stood for many things. The appreciation of natural beauty, of course, but also the idea of a civilized life, good taste, one's personal philosophy, and one's social status. Gardens also, though it is hard for us to credit, became expressions of their owners' political affiliations. Until the picturesque style emerged as part and parcel of the Romantic movement, gardens had been strictly formal, laid out with mathematical precision following the Italian and French examples. There then came a backlash against this rigid formality, led by, among others, the poet Alexander Pope. Pope and his allies argued for a more natural nature.
Today we're going to talk some more about architecture and what makes for a good design. There are, of course, a whole range of qualities that most architects would like their buildings to possess. One of these is the durability of the building. Architects must consider how well the building will stand up to the ravages of climate and time. Will it remain robust and in good condition? Clearly, requirements will vary according to the surroundings of the building in question. A design that is suitable for Dubai will have different needs from one for Moscow. Then, of course, it's essential to consider the appearance of the building. Regardless of what its purpose may be, will people find pleasure in looking at it? An original and still respected writer on architecture, the Roman Vitruvius, wrote in the 1st century that a building should delight people and should raise their spirits. Again, tastes may vary from one society to the next, but the principle remains the same.
You may not know much, if anything, about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but you have probably heard the well-known quote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." In his early work, Rousseau argued that mankind was happiest and at its best in a state of nature, that is, before the creation of society and civilization. He saw society as artificial and corrupt, and that good people were corrupted by it. The Social Contract is perhaps the most enduring and well-known of his books, covering pretty well every aspect of man in society. However, in this book, his attitude to the condition of man in a state of nature changes. In such conditions, man is brutish and competitive by nature, and there is no law or morality. Therefore, because it is easier to survive by joining forces with others, people form societies to better fight anything that might endanger their situation.
There are two main reasons why parents decide to educate their children at home. Either they dislike schools on principle, however odd those principles might be, or they don't believe their local schools provide an adequate education or the right sort of education for their children. If someone decides to teach their child at home, either by themselves or by employing a teacher, They have to convince their local education authority, LEA, that the teaching provided is satisfactory. Schedules, lesson plans and book lists must be shown, and it must also be demonstrated that the child is in fact learning and that they have adequate opportunities for physical education and meeting other children. Furthermore, while there is no formal assessment, officers from the LEA will come and inspect what is being done and look at the child's exercise books. If they are not satisfied, they make out a school attendance order.
The earliest writers on politics, and I'm thinking of Plato and Aristotle here, felt free to draw insights from all areas of human knowledge, unlike modern academic writers who tend to put things into smaller and smaller compartments or focus more closely on one area of inquiry. For example, Plato would examine a whole political system and the philosophy that underlies it, whereas modern writers on politics might concentrate on one particular institution in that system, the House of Lords in England, or on voting patterns within a country. With this focus, the bigger questions that the ancients dealt with, what is the best form of government, or what is justice, tend to get left behind. Yes, it's funny you should mention Merwin. Until about a year ago, I thought England was the only country that had a poet laureate. After all, it's a pretty odd job, isn't it? No salary to speak of and just a barrel of wine or something as payment. But he was, or is, the American poet laureate, isn't he?
That's right, but quite a few other countries have one too.
I know. I looked into it a bit. Other countries in the UK, for a start. Wales, as you'd expect, with their Eisteddfods and long poetic tradition. And Ireland and Scotland. I think some places that were colonies or in the Commonwealth have them. Canada, for example. And who's that wonderful Caribbean poet? The one that wrote Omeros.
Derek Walcott.
That's him. He was the poet laureate of St. Lucia. But what about the rest of Europe? Don't the French have such a thing?
No, I don't think so. They've got the Academy, and you get elected to that if you're considered the best in your field.
Technological change has had a profound effect on the way music is made and how it sounds, as well as on the way we listen to it. New technologies, and I mean this in the broadest sense, not just electronic devices, can alter the sound of music and, in the case of electronic recording systems, affect the economics and distribution of music. For example, the innovation of the valve trumpet in the 19th century changed the sound of the orchestra. Now, everyone has easy access to a wide variety of music, but it is arguable whether this has increased our understanding of it. Before radio and recorded music, those who could afford it would have pianos or pianolas, mechanical pianos that played a role of sheet music, so the basic ability to read notes off a page was more widespread.
Woodblocks used for pictorial illustration became fairly common in 15th century Europe, but had been used long before that for printing designs on textiles. Most of these were simple in design and quite crudely cut, but some were skillfully drawn and cut, while others even contained pictorial imagery. Records show that woodblock printing on fabrics was practiced by the Egyptians as early as 2000 years BC. The oldest existing printed fabric, which is Egyptian, dates from the 4th century. At the same time, the craft seems to have become widely established, even commonplace, elsewhere, for example in India, Mexico and Peru, where the same techniques continue to be practiced today. And the technique was almost certainly used by both the Japanese and the Chinese too.
I'd like to start this lecture on the use of technology in education by talking about a subject that's probably close to all your hearts, which is the way that student work is graded. And specifically, I want to talk to you about some of the ways written assignments or essays are marked. Well, as you all know, traditionally writing done by a student is checked, marked and graded by a teacher, a tutor, or, in some situations, an examiner. In other words, a real person. Software to mark essays has been in development for some time, and grading software on computers is already used by some universities to mark exams, but it is still viewed with suspicion by some. How can a computer mark an essay, they ask? Well, a recent study compared the human ability to give grades to student essays to the ability of a computer to do the same job. In the study, over 16,000 essays were used. These essays had already been previously marked by at least one trained human grader.
So today I'm going to talk about the key things you need to remember when you go out into the world as translators. The first thing is to be choosy about what commissions you accept. It's not advisable to agree to do every job you're offered, even if you're in need of work. You should refuse to do something if you don't know anything about the topic, as it would be impossible for you to produce a good piece of writing. And it could be serious. A mistranslation that's going to be used for medical or legal purposes could have disastrous consequences. Having decided you can reasonably take on a commission, if you have the slightest doubt about what something means, then consult a dictionary or someone whose mother tongue is the language you're translating from. It's much better to devote a bit of time and effort to checking something than to risk making a potentially serious error.
Noises are defined as disagreeable sounds, but this suggests that they are no more than an annoyance, something to be put up with. There is increasing evidence that noise, on the scale that people who live in big cities have to deal with, is dangerous and can give rise to serious health and social problems, some of which, such as its effects on people's behaviour and anger levels, you might not have thought were caused by noise and are health concerns. There is, of course, the almost constant noise of traffic, though this isn't a particularly modern problem. In ancient Rome, there were rules to minimise the noise made by the iron wheels of wagons, which battered the stones on the pavement, causing disruption of sleep. Traffic noise is one of the health hazards, as it can lead to other problems like noise-induced hearing impairment. Political parties in most democracies not only have to win more votes than their rivals to get into power, they also have to persuade the electorate that it is worth their going out to vote in the first place. In the UK, turnout is frequently low, and one reason cited is the weather. Some countries, therefore, have made voting compulsory. It is against the law not to vote, and failing to vote is a punishable offence. In Austria, for example, failure to vote results in an automatic fine, as it does in Australia. As a consequence, voter turnout is rarely less than 92% in both these countries. Other countries have penalties that affect the individual in more practical ways. In Greece, for example, although it is no longer acted on, passports were confiscated or not granted. And in Bolivia, non-voters may be banned from using banks or schools for up to 3 months. Today we have Paul Whitner, Head of Theatre Studies, here to tell us a bit about the Theatre Studies programme. Paul, what makes this course different?
Well, I think it's the environment we can offer students. We're a relatively small conservatoire, and we offer superb courses in a number of subjects, with an opportunity for performance. We've built a reputation for producing both traditional and alternative performances. I guess the course would appeal to potential students for the level of support that's available, and I mean from the tutors as well as from the fellow students and alumni. There's a real sense of community.
In places where there's been serious community tensions, Brickenden's a good example of this. There were 250 reported incidents there in 2009, often to do with neighbours and arguments, but criminal activity too. And the police will tell you that if you leave residents to sort things out for themselves, the number of incidents rises, it doesn't fall. So the local council realised that they had to do something. So they went round to people's houses and met them and their neighbours and talked to everyone and got a general idea of what the local concerns were. If there were extended families involved, they looked at those particular families more closely and all the relatives and got some of the family intervention services to talk to them. And there were some very positive results. You can pick out the hotspots, the main areas for crime.
Last week we looked at urban regeneration and some of the consequences of this, one of which was the relocation of people from urban to suburban areas to largely allow them a better standard of living, because housing is cheaper in the suburbs, so they have more disposable income. But they have to commute, and commuters need rapid transport to get them from A to B. So subway construction is, well, it's booming in some parts of the world. It's clearly being seen as the answer to the type of migration that I've just mentioned. It often gets huge public support because, well, if a subway is going to help you have a better lifestyle, then what's there to argue about? Well, quite a lot, actually. For a start, in order to go ahead with a major project of this kind, you need to be absolutely sure that the ground, and more to the point, what lies beneath the ground, can support underground transport.
It now seems likely that the earliest printing presses were, in fact, simply the common screw presses used for crushing oilseeds and herbs, or even for doing more domestic chores, such as pressing fabrics, adapted for printing. Other large wooden presses, such as those used for crushing the juice from olives and grapes, known as beam presses, had been around for centuries, but proved to be unsuitable for printing due to their size and their necessarily heavy pressure. Most presses of this type work on the simple principle of direct vertical pressure controlled by a central screw, at the lower end of which was attached a flat board, what later became known as a platen. We know that many of these earliest printing presses were still in regular use in the 17th century, and the basic design remained almost unchanged until the 19th century, when they were replaced with iron presses.